There is a small writing table in a house in the English countryside. It sits beside a door with a squeaking hinge. She never fixed the hinge. In a house that was never entirely quiet. In a life that was never entirely her own. The squeak was the one warning she had. When she heard it, the pages disappeared. Under a book, under a piece of sewing, under whatever ordinary thing was close enough to explain why a woman was sitting alone at a small table in the corner of a room. At that table, she revised and completed and brought into the form we know 6 novels that reshaped how readers understood each other, understood themselves, understood the quiet violence of a drawing room and the slow catastrophe of a bad marriage and the particular loneliness of being the sharpest mind in a room full of people who would never know it. She never married. She died at 41. Her books were published without her name. The reviews that praised them praised a person who did not officially exist. And yet, here we are, more than 200 years later, still reading her, still finding in her sentences something that feels, against all logic and all distance of time, like being understood by someone who knew exactly what you were going to be before you arrived. You know that feeling, the feeling of reading a sentence written 2 centuries ago and thinking, somehow, that it was written for you. That is what she does. That is what she has always done. Her name was Jane Austen. This is her complete life. Not the comfortable version with the bonnet and the garden and the charming romance. The real version, the one with the difficult years and the money problems, and the morning she made a decision that cost her everything the world said a woman needed, and gave her everything she actually needed instead. Settle in. Let the noise outside go quiet. Let the distance between your century and hers close a little. She has something to tell you. Chapter 1. The World She Was Born Into. Begin in December of 1775. In a village in Hampshire called Steventon. Not London. Not Bath. Not the grand estates that fill the pages of the novels she would eventually write. A rectory at the end of a muddy lane, surrounded by elm trees and the particular quiet of the English countryside in winter. A quiet that was not peaceful so much as it was the natural sound of a world that had not yet been asked to be anything other than what it was. Cold fields. A frozen lane. The church where her father preached, standing a short walk away in the dark. Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December, 1775, the 7th of 8 children. Her father, George Austen, was the rector of Steventon parish, an educated man in modest circumstances, the kind of man who owned more books than furniture and considered that a reasonable set of priorities. He maintained a large personal library for a country clergyman of his means, several hundred volumes covering history and poetry and theology and fiction, and he did not restrict his children's access to any of it. Her mother, Cassandra Lee Austen, was sharp-tongued and socially observant and wrote verse for her own amusement, a habit her daughter would inherit and transform into something the world had not yet seen. The house was not large. The family was not wealthy in any sense that the England of 1775 would have recognized as wealth. George Austen supplemented his clerical income by taking in young men as boarding pupils, which meant the rectory was always a little too full and a little too loud, always in motion, always generating the particular domestic noise that comes from a household where many people with different needs are trying to occupy the same small space at the same time. This matters more than it might seem. Jane Austen did not develop her extraordinary ear for human speech by sitting in refined rooms listening to witty people perform for each other. She developed it by growing up in a house where conversation was the primary entertainment and observation was the primary skill, where the texture of daily life was social in the most immediate sense, and where the gap between what people said and what they meant was legible to anyone paying close enough attention. She was paying close attention from the beginning. England, in 1775, was a country in the middle of changes it did not yet fully understand. The American colonies were in open revolt. The war that would become the American Revolution was already underway, and the arguments it generated about liberty and representation and the rights of individuals against inherited authority were not confined to the colonies. They travelled back across the Atlantic in newspapers and in the conversations of educated men in rectories and coffee-houses across England. The French Revolution was 14 years away, but the conditions that would produce it were already visible to anyone looking carefully. The way that birth and inheritance had organised everything for so long, and the way that the middle-class Austen would spend her life writing about was beginning, quietly and without fanfare, to invent itself. The Austen family occupied a specific and precarious position in this world. Genteel, but not wealthy. Educated, but not powerful. Connected to the gentry by blood and by expectation, but never insulated from the financial anxieties that could reduce a family like theirs to real hardship with the death of a single breadwinner. George Austen's income from the church was stable but not large. There was never a margin wide enough to make the future feel entirely safe. Jane grew up understanding this, not resentfully, as far as the record shows, but clearly. The older brothers moved through the world in the ways available to men of their time and class. James went into the church like his father. Edward was adopted by wealthy cousins, the Knight family, and inherited their estate at Godmersham in Kent. A piece of luck so improbable it reads like a plot device. Except that Austen's novels are too honest for luck that clean. Henry went into banking after a military career. Frank and Charles entered the Royal Navy as boys and would sail through the Napoleonic Wars while their sister sat at a small table in Hampshire and wrote about the world they had all grown up in. Cassandra, 1 year older than Jane, was something else entirely. She was Jane's closest companion for the whole of her life, the person to whom most of the surviving letters were written, and the person who, after Jane died, went carefully through the correspondence and burned the letters she judged too private for any other eye to see. What was in those letters we will never know. What Cassandra chose to preserve tells us something. What she chose to destroy tells us something else. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In 1775, in a rectory in Hampshire, the seventh child of the Austen family arrived in a world that had clear ideas about what her life would look like. She would be educated well enough to be an attractive prospect for marriage. She would marry. She would manage a household. She would be remembered, if she was remembered at all, as someone's wife and someone's mother. That was the plan. The plan did not account for what was already forming behind those watching eyes. She began writing as soon as she could hold a pen, not careful compositions designed to demonstrate a young woman's accomplishments. Sharp, funny, precise little pieces that engaged with the conventions of the fiction she was reading and the society she was observing, with a confidence that no one taught her, and that no formal instruction could have produced if the instinct had not already been there. She was 12 when she wrote a comic history of England that mocked the pomposity of the official historical texts she had been made to read. It was funny. It was also, for a 12-year-old, accomplished in a way that suggested she already understood something fundamental about the gap between the official version of things and the version that was actually true. She was not a prodigy in the way the word is usually used. She did not write a perfect novel at 15. She wrote imperfect things at 15 that contained within them, like seeds in difficult soil, everything she would eventually grow into. The instinct was always there. The craft took time. The world she needed to observe in order to write about it with full authority took time too. She had, as it turned out, less time than she knew, but in December of 1775, in a rectory in Hampshire, with the elm trees bare and the lane frozen and the whole of her life still ahead of her, none of that was visible yet. Only the beginning was visible, and the beginning looked a great deal like a girl in a library, reading everything she could find, arguing silently with all of it. Chapter 2. A Girl Who Read Everything. The library at Steventon Rectory smelled of paper and leather and the particular dusty warmth of books that have been handled often enough to carry the traces of the hands that held them. Jane Austen spent a great deal of her childhood in that room. George Austen owned several hundred volumes, a collection unusual in its size and range for a country clergyman of his means. History, poetry, philosophy, theology, and fiction, including the novels that were then transforming English literature from a relatively new and somewhat disreputable form into something that serious people were beginning to take seriously. He did not restrict his daughter's access to any of it. This was not nothing. In the England of the 1780s and 1790s, the question of what women should read was a genuine cultural argument, and the anxious answer offered by many parents and educators was that women should read carefully selected things, uplifting things, instructive things, certainly not the novels flooding the market and filling the heads of impressionable young women with ideas about romance and independence and the authority of their own feelings. The novel was suspected. The novel, in the wrong hands, could do damage. George Austen apparently did not share these anxieties. His daughter read everything. She read Samuel Richardson, whose novel Pamela had essentially invented the idea of interiority in English fiction, the notion that what a character thinks and feels is as consequential as what they do. She read Henry Fielding, whose Tom Jones moved through the social world with a comic energy and breadth that Richardson's more confined novels did not attempt. She read Fanny Burney, whose novels Evelina and Cecilia gave her something she could not find in Richardson or Fielding, the experience of a woman writer taking women's social experience seriously as a subject worthy of serious fiction. She did not read these books the way a student reads assigned texts. She read them the way a writer reads, which is to say, she read them in argument. She agreed with some of what she found. She disagreed with more. She found the sentimentality of certain fashionable novels not moving but faintly absurd, and a mind like hers could not encounter absurdity without wanting to take it apart and show what was actually inside. The result was the juvenilia. Between roughly the ages of 11 and 17, Austen filled 3 notebooks with pieces she called Volume the First, Volume the Second, and Volume the Third. These notebooks survived. They are in archives now, handled with the care that institutions give to things that turned out to matter. And they are remarkable, not because they show a genius in full flower, but because they show a mind discovering, through play and through argument, what its particular gift actually was. The History of England, written when she was around 15, is a parody of the historical writing she had been made to read. It is narrated by a self-declared partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian who takes sides with cheerful irreverence and mocks the solemnity of official history with the confidence of someone who has already understood that official versions of things are almost always serving someone's interests. It is very funny. It is also, for a 15-year-old, a serious piece of thinking about the relationship between narrative and power, love and friendship. The spelling was hers. Written when she was around 14, is a parody of the sentimental novel that reads like the work of someone who has consumed an enormous quantity of that fiction and found the whole enterprise not just inferior but faintly dishonest. The heroines faint. The heroes are impossibly noble. The language collapses under the weight of its own excess. And Austen is pulling every string, showing you exactly how the machinery works, inviting you to see how hollow the conventions become once you understand how they function. What she was doing in these early pieces was finding her voice by a process of elimination. She did not yet know precisely what she wanted to say, but she knew with considerable precision what she did not want to say, what she did not believe, what she found false in the fiction that was supposed to represent the world she lived in. The juvenilia are the record of a mind clearing the ground. The writers who shaped her most are not always the most obvious ones to name. Fanny Burney mattered more than is sometimes acknowledged. Burney had placed a young woman with limited social power at the centre of a novel and shown, with genuine insight and genuine comedy, how that woman navigated a world that was simultaneously offering her everything and denying her everything that actually mattered. The social comedy in Burney is real. The constraints are real. The gap between what the heroine is permitted to want and what she actually wants is the engine driving the story forward. Austen inherited that engine, and she rebuilt it from the inside. Because Burney's heroines do not quite have what Austen's heroines have, which is the capacity to be wrong. Burney's Evelina is essentially right about almost everything, and simply needs the world to recognize it. Austen's heroines are capable of profound and consequential errors of judgment, and those errors are not weaknesses in the novels. They are the novels. The whole point is that intelligence and sensitivity and good intentions are not sufficient protection against the blindness that comes from being too certain of your own reading of a situation. That insight did not come from books alone. It came from living in a house that was always full, always in motion, always generating the social material that a watching mind could absorb. She was observing. She was always observing. The neighbours and the visiting pupils and the brothers coming home from their various lives and the conversations in rooms that were never quite private. All of it was being taken in by a mind that understood, instinctively and long before she could have articulated it, that the comedy of human behaviour and the sadness of it are not opposites. They are the same thing seen from different distances. Think about the last time you watched someone confidently explain a situation that you could already see they had wrong. That small gap between what they believed and what was actually true, Austen built an entire literary method on that gap, and she understood it first not from theory, but from years of watching it happen in a rectory in Hampshire. By her middle teens, she had read enough and observed enough and written enough imperfect things to understand something that most writers take decades to grasp. The books she read were not models to imitate. They were conversations to participate in. When she wrote a parody of the sentimental novel, she was not just making fun of a form she found inferior. She was making a counterclaim about what fiction could do and had not yet managed to do. Her argument, stated plainly, was this: the world is not what the sentimental novel says it is. People are not consistently noble or consistently villainous. They are inconsistent and self-deceiving and sometimes funny and sometimes genuinely sad and almost always more complicated than the story being told about them, including the story they are telling about themselves. Fiction that pretends otherwise is not just aesthetically inferior, it is dishonest. And dishonesty in fiction has consequences, because people read fiction to understand the world, and if the fiction lies, the understanding it produces is built on false ground. She was a teenager when she began to understand this. She would spend the rest of her life working out what it meant in practice. The library at Steventon was the first classroom. The 3 notebooks were the first drafts, the mind forming itself in that room, surrounded by books and the daily theatre of a large family, was becoming something that the England of 1785 had no existing category for. It did not know that yet, but it was getting there, one argument at a time. Chapter 3. The Years of Dancing and Drafts. Picture the Basingstoke Assembly Rooms on a winter evening in 1795. Candlelight on polished floors, the sound of a small orchestra tuning before the first set, women in white muslin moving through the warm air, men in dark coats, the low particular hum of a room full of people who have come here, officially, to dance, and who are also, unofficially, engaged in the serious business of assessing each other with a thoroughness that the social forms barely conceal. Jane Austen was 20 years old, and she was in that room. She danced. She talked. She was, by all accounts of the period, lively and quick and attractive in ways that had more to do with the quality of her conversation than with conventional beauty. Her letters from these years describe the dances with an eye that is simultaneously amused and genuinely engaged. She participated, and she observed, and she did both at once, which is a rare capacity, and one that would eventually define everything she wrote. The world around her expected her to be thinking primarily about marriage. This was not an unreasonable expectation. Marriage was the central project of a young woman's life in the England of the 1790s, not because young women were shallow or unambitious, but because marriage was the only structure through which a woman of Austen's class could secure any kind of future at all. Without a husband, a woman was dependent on her family for her entire life. Without a husband, she had no property, no legal standing, no household of her own. She had nothing beyond the goodwill of the people who happened to be related to her. Austen understood this completely. She was too clear-eyed to have grown up in the world she grew up in, and missed the mechanics of it. She watched what happened to women who did not marry. She watched what happened to women who married badly. She watched what happened to women who married well. And she noticed, with the precision that would eventually become her literary signature, that marrying well and being happy were related but not identical outcomes. She went to the dances because she was human and she enjoyed them. She also watched everything that happened in them. Then, sometime in the late months of 1795, she met Tom Lefroy. He was a young Irish law student visiting his uncle, the Reverend George Lefroy of the neighbouring parish at Ash. He was 20 years old. He was clever and lively and apparently good-looking, and he had read Henry Fielding, which Austen noted in a letter to Cassandra with something that sounds like genuine pleasure, because Fielding was considered slightly racy for a young woman to acknowledge, and the mutual recognition between two people who both understood why that mattered carried its own particular warmth. The letters she wrote to Cassandra in January of 1796 describe something that reads, even at 2 centuries of distance, and through the filter of what Cassandra chose to preserve, like the genuine excitement of a young woman who has encountered someone worth being excited about. She is playful. She is ironic about it in the way she was ironic about everything. But the irony is not a wall. It is the texture of how she experienced things. Not a protection against feeling, but the medium through which she expressed it. They danced together at several parties over the Christmas season. They talked. They flirted with a directness that was just close enough to the edge of proper behaviour to be worth noting in the letters. And then it ended. The precise mechanics are not fully documented in any source that survives. What the evidence suggests is that both families applied the pressure that families applied in such situations. Tom Lefroy had no money of his own and was dependent on his uncle for his future prospects. Jane Austen had no dowry worth speaking of. A match between 2 young people with no financial foundation was not a romantic possibility that the practical adults around them were willing to encourage. Tom left Hampshire. He returned to Ireland. He eventually married a woman with money, had a successful legal career, and became Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. Late in his life, when he was very old and Austen was long dead and famous, he told a nephew that he had been in love with her, and then he corrected himself. A boyish love, he said, which may have been the truth. Or it may have been the quiet self-protection of an old man who had made the practical choice and needed to believe it had not cost him anything that mattered. What it cost Austen is harder to know from the outside. The letters she wrote to Cassandra in the months after he left are not preserved in their complete form. What she wrote about it directly, if she wrote about it directly, is among the things that Cassandra burned. What survives is the fiction she was beginning to write at exactly this time. She had been working on a novel she called Eleanor and Marianne since around 1795, a story about 2 sisters with opposite temperaments navigating the aftermath of romantic disappointment. Eleanor controlled and rational, holding her feelings behind the social forms that keep people functional. Marianne, expressive and passionate, convinced that the intensity of feeling is itself a moral argument for its expression. The novel that would eventually become Sense and Sensibility was being shaped by a young woman who was living, at the same time, precisely the tension she was writing about. The tension between what you feel and what you are permitted to express, between what you want and what the world has decided is available to you. It would be too simple to say she was Eleanor or that she was Marianne. She was neither, and she was both, which is the honest answer, and the one her fiction consistently pushed toward. She was also, in 1796 and 1797, working on something new, a novel about a young woman named Elizabeth Bennet and a proud, wealthy man named Darcy, and the elaborate mutual misunderstanding that had to be entirely dismantled before either of them could see each other clearly. She called it First Impressions. She completed a full draft in roughly 10 months. For a 21-year-old writing in the margins of a domestic life that had many other claims on her time and attention, it was an extraordinary pace. George Austen was so impressed that he wrote to a London publisher in November of 1797, offering the manuscript for consideration. The publisher declined without reading it. The novel that would eventually become Pride and Prejudice, the novel that has remained continuously in print, that has been adapted more times than anyone has properly counted, that has been read by more people than any reliable estimate can fully capture, was rejected, sight unseen, by a man who could not have known what he was turning away. Austen, apparently, took this calmly. She revised. She kept writing. She began work on a third novel about a young woman taken to Bath, who finds the social world there both thrilling and faintly sinister. The years between 1795 and 1800 were the years of her apprenticeship in the deepest sense, not the apprenticeship of learning to write. She had been doing that since she was 11. The apprenticeship of understanding what she was actually trying to do, what fiction could do that nothing else could do, what she, specifically, was positioned to contribute. The dances continued. The social rounds continued. The domestic life of the Steventon rectory made its daily claims on her time. And at the small table, in the hours between the official hours, the pages accumulated. She was building something. She did not yet know that the world she was building it in was about to shift under her feet. But the work was real, and the work would survive what came next. Chapter 4. The Proposal She Refused. November the 2nd, 1802. She said yes in the evening. She took it back in the morning. In between was a night that no document records in full, because the letter that would have recorded it is among the ones Cassandra burned. What we have is the outline of an event whose external facts are documented and whose emotional interior, as the decision itself makes visible, belongs entirely to Jane Austen and to the darkness of a bedroom in a Hampshire country house in the early hours of a November morning. The house was Manydown Park, the home of the big family, old friends of the Austens, people Jane had known since childhood. The visit was comfortable and familiar, and it had just become something else entirely. Harris Big Wither was the son of the house. He was 21 years old, 5 years younger than Austen. He was tall, and he stammered, and he was not particularly witty or intellectually lively, or interested in the things she found most interesting in the world. But he was the heir to Manydown Park. He had a substantial income. He had land and standing, and a future as secure as anything available in the England of 1802. That evening, he proposed, and Jane Austen said yes. This is the part of the story that the comfortable version of her life tends to move past quickly, because it complicates the narrative of the woman who chose independence over the compromises of marriage. The truth is more human and more difficult than that narrative allows. She said yes, whatever moved through her mind in that moment, whatever the weight of her circumstances felt like in the warmth of an evening among old friends. She said yes. She went to bed engaged. She lay in the dark and understood that she could not go through with it, not because she was waiting for a grand passion, The letters she wrote throughout her life suggest a woman entirely clear-eyed about the difference between the love in novels and the actual texture of a long shared life. She was not holding out for Darcy. She was not confused about what Harris Bigwither was offering. She lay awake and understood, in the plain specific terms of someone who has stopped telling herself the comfortable version, that marrying a man she did not respect in order to secure a house was not a compromise. It was a corruption. It was the arrangement she had been writing against since she was 15. The social transaction in which a woman traded herself for security and called it reasonable, and lived the rest of her life in a room that belonged to someone else, in every way that actually mattered. She had written about it. She knew exactly what it looked like from the inside. She could not be that person past morning. In the early light, she told Harris Bigwither she had changed her mind. She and Cassandra left Manydown Park that same day, earlier than planned, in circumstances that must have been deeply uncomfortable for everyone in the house. The financial reality of what she had just done was not abstract. She was 26 years old in a social world that understood 26 as late, not in a cruel sense, but in the practical sense of a marriage market working against her with each passing year. Her father's income would end when her father died. What came after would depend on the goodwill of brothers who had their own families and their own pressures. A woman in her position who did not marry was making a real financial choice with real consequences that would be felt not just by herself, but by everyone connected to her. Harris Bigwither could have given her Manydown Park. She walked away in the morning. What she walked away toward was uncertain. What she walked away from was clear. And the clarity of what she refused tells you something essential about who she was and what the writing meant to her, not as a pleasant hobby or a natural overflow of gentle temperament, but as the thing she was. The work that required a self she was not willing to sell. She had been writing about Charlotte Lucas while she was becoming her for one night. Charlotte Lucas is Elizabeth Bennet's friend in Pride and Prejudice. The woman who marries the ridiculous Mr. Collins at 27 because she has assessed her situation accurately and made the rational choice. Austen does not condemn Charlotte. She renders her with a compassion that comes from understanding the choice from the inside. Charlotte is not wrong about her situation. She has simply decided that the rational and the good are not always the same thing, and she has chosen the rational. Austen spent one night being Charlotte Lucas. She found she could not sustain it past morning. There would not be another proposal. Not in any form, the record documents. The domestic security that Manydown Park represented was not replaced by anything equivalent. What came instead was uncertainty, and the particular vulnerability of a woman whose future depended on arrangements she could not control. She went back to Steventon. She kept writing. Some choices define a person not by what they gain, but by what they demonstrate they cannot sell. That November morning, in a Hampshire country house, with the fields cold outside and the rest of her life still entirely unwritten, Jane Austen demonstrated what she could not sell. She would spend the rest of her life living with the consequences. She would also spend the rest of her life writing the novels that required the person she refused to give up. The novels have always been the most honest answer to the question of whether it was worth it. They just require knowing how to read them. Chapter 5. Bath, the city that almost broke her. The announcement came on an ordinary afternoon in the autumn of 1800. No preparation, no consultation, no letter sent ahead to Cassandra, who was away visiting. so that the news could be absorbed privately before having to be managed socially. Jane was at home at Steventon when her mother announced, with the brisk practicality of a woman communicating a decision already made, that the family was leaving. George Austen was retiring from the church. He would hand the Steventon living to his son James. The family would move to Bath. A niece recorded later, based on family memory, that Jane fainted when she heard. Whether that is literally true, or whether the story acquired its drama in the retelling, the family tradition preserves something real about the impact. This was not ordinary news. This was the removal of everything familiar, delivered without warning, in a form that required no response, because the decision was not hers to make. She was 24 years old. She had lived her entire life in Steventon. The rectory, the library, the elm trees, the particular social world of rural Hampshire that had been her primary material since she was 11. All of it was being replaced with Bath, a city she already knew, a city she already had complicated feelings about. Bath in 1800 was at the height of its fame as a resort. The Royal Crescent and the circus and the pump room represented the most elegant urban planning in England outside London. The assembly rooms provided concerts and dances and card parties in continuous succession. The streets were full of people doing the things that people with leisure and social ambition do when they are concentrated in sufficient numbers in one place. It was also beginning to show its age. The genuinely fashionable world was drifting toward other destinations. What remained was still beautiful, still socially rich, but carrying the particular quality of a place that knows it is no longer quite what it was and has organized its social life, partly around not acknowledging this. Austen noticed all of it. What she found harder to transform into fiction was the sheer exhaustion of displacement. The Steventon rectory had been the ground beneath everything she wrote. Its library, its rhythms, its familiar social world. Bath was different material, and for reasons that had as much to do with her emotional state as with the material itself. She could not work with it. The creative record of the Bath years, roughly 1800 to 1806, is nearly blank. She made some revisions to earlier manuscripts. She worked on a piece now called The Watsons, a fragment that survives and that reads like a writer trying to restart an engine that will not catch. The voice is recognizable. Something essential is missing. What was missing was stability. A writer is not only a mind. A writer is a mind plus conditions. And the conditions in Bath were wrong in almost every way that mattered. Then her father died, January of 1805. George Austen was 73 years old, and his death was not entirely unexpected. But the death of a father is never only a biographical event, and for Austen it carried the immediate financial consequence she had known was coming, and that knowing did not make easier when it arrived. The family income collapsed. What remained was a small amount of interest on modest savings, and the contributions her brothers agreed to make to the support of their mother and sisters. They were not destitute. They were not comfortable. They occupied the anxious middle ground between those two states that Austen had been writing about from the outside for years, and was now inhabiting from within. She and Cassandra and their mother moved through successive lodgings in Bath, none of them quite right, none of them home. The letters from this period have the same intelligence, the same dry notation of social reality, the same wit, The capacity was not gone. The conditions for exercising it at the level the novels required were simply not present. It is worth being clear about what this failure meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean the years were wasted. The social world of Bath, the pump room and the assembly rooms and the intricate performance of status by people who were mostly less secure than their presentation suggested, was material she was absorbing even when she could not use it. It would come out later. It always came out later. Northanger Abbey, drafted in the Steventon years, but never published in her lifetime, uses Bath with a satirical edge that could only have been sharpened by time spent actually living there. The social pretension, the anxious status management, the beautiful architecture providing a stage for behaviours that are anything but elegant. All of it is rendered with an accuracy that goes beyond what a visitor could have observed. Persuasion returns to Bath for its final section. The Bath of Persuasion is a place of noise and social suffocation from which the characters escape with visible relief. The emotional register of those scenes is the register of a writer working from memory, from the specific weight of a place that had pressed on her for years. She did not love Bath. Bath did not suit her, and in 1806 the Austen women left the city for good, moving first to Southampton and then, in 1809, to a cottage in the Hampshire village of Chawton. The cottage was offered by her brother Edward, who had property available as part of the estate the Knight family had left him. It was modest, 4 bedrooms, a small garden, a parlour where a table could be placed near a window. The table was small. The door that led to the front hallway had a hinge that squeaked. She was 33 years old. She had not published a single novel. She had drafts sitting in desk drawers for years, waiting for the conditions that Bath had refused to provide. The conditions were coming. The silence of the Hampshire countryside was not the silence of nothing happening. It was the silence of a mind finally given the room it needed. Chapter 6. Chawton, the Squeaking Door. July of 1809. She arrived with Cassandra and their mother and Martha Lloyd, a family friend who would live with them for years. They came with their furniture and their books and the modest collection of possessions that represented everything they had accumulated across the displacement years. They came to a cottage at the edge of a village on the main road through Hampshire, close enough to the road that the sound of passing carriages was a constant presence, and the life of the village moved just outside the windows. She was 33 years old. She had not published a single novel. The cottage had a parlour on the ground floor where the light came in at a good angle in the mornings. She placed a small table near the window in that parlour. The door connecting the parlour to the front hallway had a hinge that squeaked when it opened, a sound audible from anywhere in the room. She never had the hinge fixed. Her niece, Caroline, who visited often enough to observe the household with the clear eyes of a child paying close attention to the adults around her, later recorded this detail. The squeak was the warning. When she heard it, the manuscript disappeared under whatever was nearby. A book, a piece of sewing, anything ordinary enough to explain why a woman was sitting at a small table in the corner of a room. The visitor entered and found nothing remarkable, just a woman sitting quietly. This image has sometimes been read as evidence of modesty, of feminine propriety, of a reluctance to be known as a writer. That reading is too simple and probably too convenient for the social arrangements that made it necessary. The more practical reading is this. She was a professional writer working in a shared house without a room of her own, managing the conditions available to her with the same intelligence she brought to everything. The hinge was not fixed because the squeak was useful. The pages were hidden not from shame, but from the simple necessity of maintaining a private working space in a house where private space did not structurally exist. She was making do. She had always been making do. What happened at Chawton, within months of her arrival, was not a gradual recovery of lost confidence. It was closer to a door opening in the truest sense. She began revising Sense and Sensibility with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting a long time for the right conditions and intends to make full use of them now that they have arrived. The household arranged itself around the writing without ever announcing that it was doing so. Mrs. Austen gardened with the energy of a woman who preferred the outdoors to the indoors and was happy there. Cassandra managed the household. The shopping and the cooking and the 100 small logistical demands that kept a house functional, Martha Lloyd contributed her share. The arrangement was never formally stated as being organised around Jane's writing needs, but that is what it was. The people who shared that cottage understood, even if none of them would have used this language, that what was happening at the small table in the parlour deserved to be protected. The routine her niece Caroline described was consistent across the Chawton years. Early rising, before the rest of the household was awake. Time at the piano, in the parlour, in the quiet of early morning. A transition from sleep to the particular kind of wakefulness the writing required. Then, after breakfast, the work. She worked in the flow of domestic life, not sealed from it, in the parlour, at the small table, with the household moving around her, and the road outside carrying its daily traffic, and the hinge ready to squeak at any moment. And from those conditions came the work that has never stopped travelling. She revised Sense and Sensibility into its final form. She transformed First Impressions into Pride and Prejudice. She wrote Mansfield Park, more formally ambitious and more morally serious than anything she had previously completed. She wrote Emma, the most technically demanding work of her career. She would complete Persuasion and begin Sanditon before illness stopped the pen. It is worth being precise about what Chawton gave those manuscripts. Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice had their origins in the Steventon years, in drafts written in the 1790s that had survived the Bath displacement waiting in desk drawers. What Chawton gave them was not their beginning, it was their completion, the settled daily rhythm, the household organised around the possibility of sustained work, the simple stability of knowing that tomorrow morning the table would be there, and the light would come in at the same angle, and the pages could continue. Stability is not the material of literary mythology. Mythology prefers suffering and isolation and genius produced against impossible odds. But stability is what the particular kind of art Austen was making actually required, the kind that depends on sustained and precise attention to human behaviour, the kind that cannot be rushed or compressed without losing the quality of observation that makes it real. Chawton gave her that. The visitors came. Nephews and nieces arrived for extended stays. The local social world of Hampshire provided its dances and its calls. She visited Godmersham and observed the grander world that Edward's inheritance had given him access to. She went to London, staying with Henry, and used those visits to manage the business of publication, meeting publishers, correcting proofs, dealing with the practical machinery of getting books into the world. She was not withdrawn. She was engaged on terms she could manage, in ways that fed the writing rather than depleting it. In 1815, she received a letter from the librarian of the Prince Regent informing her that His Royal Highness was an admirer of her novels, and that the Royal Library at Carlton House was at her disposal. She was informed, with a courtesy that barely concealed the fact that it was not a suggestion, that her next novel might be dedicated to His Royal Highness. Austen did not admire the Prince Regent. She found his treatment of his wife, Princess Caroline, deplorable, and said so in letters with the directness she reserved for things she found genuinely wrong. But she was not in a position to decline what was effectively a royal request. Emma was dedicated to His Royal Highness the Prince Regent. The dedication is entirely formal. It contains not one word of genuine warmth. It is the dedication of a woman fulfilling an obligation she could not refuse, doing so with the absolute minimum of sentiment that social form permitted, and almost certainly finding the whole business privately amusing. The hinge squeaked. The pages went under the book. The visitor entered and found a woman sitting quietly. They had no idea. And then, one morning, the pages would not need to hide any more, because the book would be finished and the book would go out into the world. That morning kept coming, again and again, 6 times. Chapter 7. Publishing without a name. The cover of Sense and Sensibility, published in October of 1811 by Thomas Egerton of Whitehall, carried 2 words where an author's name would normally appear: by a lady. That was the entirety of the identification. A woman had written this. Which woman was not information the book intended to provide. Austen was 35 years old when it appeared. She had been writing seriously for more than 20 years. The novel was not a first effort. It was a mature work that had been drafted and revised and reconsidered over more than a decade. Shaped by everything she had observed and understood in the years since, the original version had taken shape in the Steventon rectory. The decision to publish without her name was not purely personal preference. Though she was genuinely private about her writing, it reflected the social world she lived in, one in which a gentlewoman who published novels was making a public claim on intellectual space that the conventions of the time found at best mildly transgressive. Women published. Some were respected for it, but the social calculus was delicate, and for a woman of Austen's class, who intended to remain functional in the social world she inhabited, anonymity was the practical choice. The practical arrangements required her brother Henry's assistance. Henry was the most sociable and commercially worldly of the brothers, comfortable in London business circles in ways that made him a useful intermediary between his sister's manuscripts and the publishers who might receive them. He acted as her informal literary agent, making initial approaches, managing negotiations, collecting payments and forwarding them to Hampshire. The publishing world of 1811 was not organised to deal directly with anonymous lady authors, and Henry smoothed the frictions that would have made the process considerably harder. The financial terms were not generous. Austen published Sense and Sensibility on commission, meaning she bore the financial risk herself. If the book did not sell enough to cover printing costs, the shortfall was hers. She set aside money from her modest savings to cover the potential loss. The practical acknowledgement of a woman who had been living with financial uncertainty long enough to be realistic about it. The book sold, not in numbers that a later era would consider significant, but solidly enough for a first novel by an unknown author in a competitive market. The first edition sold out. A second was needed. The financial return to Austen was approximately £140, modest by any standard, but entirely her own, earned by her own work, belonging to no one else. For a woman, in her circumstances, that was not nothing. Pride and Prejudice appeared in January of 1813, also by Egerton, also anonymously. The cover identified the author as, by the author of Sense and Sensibility. A lady was becoming a body of work, even without a name attached. The reception was of a different order entirely. The first edition sold out within weeks. Second and third editions followed rapidly. The social world of London was speculating about the identity of the author. People were passing copies among their circles with the excitement of a book that has done something with recognizable material that no one had quite done before. Letters and diaries from the period record readers encountering Elizabeth Bennet for the first time with the particular pleasure of finding a character who feels independently alive, who seems to exist beyond the pages containing her. Austen recorded her own response to the published novel in a letter to Cassandra that is worth knowing in its honest complexity. She called it her own darling child, and then she worried about it. She thought it was too light and bright and sparkling, that it wanted shade, that a long chapter of sense inserted here and there would have improved it. She was probably right. She was almost always right about her own work, including about its limitations. The secret of her authorship did not hold for long. Henry Austen, proud of his sister in ways that were genuine and warm and constitutionally incompatible with silence, told people, not officially, not with her permission, but he told people, and the people he told others, and within a relatively short time the literary circles of London had a reasonably clear picture of who had been writing the novels by a lady. Austen navigated this with the composure she brought to everything uncomfortable. She did not confirm publicly. She continued to publish anonymously, but she was aware that the protection of anonymity was becoming more nominal than real. The correspondence with the Prince Regent's librarian, James Stanier Clarke, became one of the more revealing exchanges of the Chawton years. Clarke, apparently convinced that a successful lady novelist would welcome specific direction about what to write next, proposed a novel about a clergyman modelled on Clarke himself, and later a historical romance about the House of Coburg in honour of an upcoming royal marriage. Austen declined both with a courtesy so precisely calibrated that only a close reading reveals what lies beneath it. She explained that the kind of novel Clarke was proposing was entirely beyond her capabilities. She could only write what she knew. She said, she lacked the resources for a historical work. She could not render a clergyman convincingly, because she had never had sufficient opportunity to observe the type closely. This from a woman who had grown up in a rectory, whose father was a clergyman, whose brother James was a clergyman, who had spent 40 years in close proximity to the clerical profession. She did not write the novel about the House of Coburg. The financial record she kept across her writing years tells a story that the romantic version of her life tends to understate. Sense and Sensibility earned approximately £140. Pride and Prejudice was sold outright to Egerton for £110. Given the novel's continued sales, that transaction likely represented considerably less than the copyright's full value. Though the exact figures remain a matter of scholarly examination, Mansfield Park earned approximately £300 across 2 editions. Emma, published by the more prestigious John Murray in 1815, earned approximately £220. The total across her writing career was somewhere in the range of £600 to £700. With scholars continuing to examine the full picture, it was real money. It was not financial independence in any absolute sense, but it was entirely hers. And in the social world, she inhabited that represented a form of agency that very few women of her time and class possessed in comparable measure. She published without her name because the world she lived in made that the practical choice. She published anyway because the work required it. The name would come. It would come after her death, attached to books already doing what they were built to do, finding their way into the hands of readers who discovered in them something that felt, against all probability, like the truth. The truth does not require a name on a cover to travel. It just requires someone willing to write it, at a small table, behind a door that squeaks. Chapter 8. What she was actually doing in those novels. Stop here for a moment. Before we go further into the life, we need to go deeper into the work. Because there is a version of Jane Austen that 2 centuries of adaptation and cultural affection have constructed with considerable care, and that version sits between the modern reader and what she was actually doing in those novels, like a pleasant, slightly distorting piece of glass. It shows you something real. It does not show you everything, and what it leaves out is, in several respects, the most important part. The version most people carry goes something like this. Jane Austen wrote charming novels about the marriage market in Regency England. Her heroines are witty and spirited. Her heroes are proud and eventually humbled. The obstacles between them are social and financial and ultimately surmountable. Love wins. The right people find each other. The reader closes the book feeling that the world, for these particular people in this particular corner of England, has arranged itself correctly. That version is not wrong. It is incomplete in ways that matter enormously, because what Austen was actually doing in those novels was something considerably more radical and considerably more unsettling than the comfortable version suggests. She was not primarily writing about love. She was writing about the ways that intelligent people deceive themselves, about the catastrophic consequences of that self-deception, about the extraordinary difficulty of seeing clearly in a world that provides every incentive to see what you want to see rather than what is actually there. Think about that for a moment. Think about the last time you were absolutely certain you understood a situation, certain enough that you stopped really looking at it, and then discovered later that you had been wrong in ways that, in retrospect, should have been visible all along. That specific experience of retrospective clarity, the slightly uncomfortable recognition of a person who has been telling themselves a story and has just encountered the evidence that the story was wrong. That is the territory Jane Austen was mapping, novel after novel, with a precision no one before her had managed in quite the same way. The technical instrument she developed to do this had not been deployed in English fiction before her with anything approaching the consistency and mastery she brought to it. It has a name now, a name that literary scholars use with the ease of long familiarity: free indirect discourse. At the time she was using it, it did not have a name because no one had used it with the sustained command she brought to the form. Here is what it is. Stated as plainly as possible, free indirect discourse is a way of inhabiting a character's consciousness without fully committing to it. The narrator does not step back and report what the character thinks. As a more traditional narrator would, the narrator does not fully become the character and speak from entirely inside that consciousness. As a first-person narrator would, instead, the narrative voice and the character's consciousness blend in a way that is deliberately and precisely ambiguous. The reader is simultaneously inside the character's perception and just slightly outside it, close enough to feel what the character feels, far enough back to begin to see what the character cannot see. The most important thing that Austen's characters consistently cannot see is themselves. Elizabeth Bennet is one of the most charming heroines in English literature. She is also, for the first half of Pride and Prejudice, significantly wrong about almost everything that matters. She is wrong about Darcy. She is wrong about Wickham. She is wrong about Jane's feelings and wrong about her own. She is wrong with the particular confidence of a very intelligent person who has learned to trust her own judgment and has not yet encountered the evidence that her judgment has real and consequential limits. The novel is not the story of Elizabeth falling in love with Darcy. That is the plot. The novel is the story of Elizabeth learning to see, learning to distinguish between the story she has been telling herself about the people around her and what is actually true, learning that her quickness of perception, her wit, her capacity for rapid, confident judgment are not protections against error. They are, in certain circumstances, sources of it, because they have made her too certain in her first impressions and too resistant to revising them when the evidence requires it. The original title was First Impressions. The published title is Pride and Prejudice. Both point at the same thing from different angles. Now, picture the scene. Elizabeth at the Netherfield ball, watching Darcy, drawing her sharp conclusions. The candles overhead, the music playing, the room full of the particular social theatre that Austen rendered better than anyone. Elizabeth is confident. Elizabeth is funny. Elizabeth is wrong. And we are inside her confidence with her, laughing along, because the narrative has placed us so precisely inside her perspective that her errors feel like our errors. Her certainty feels like our certainty. Right up to the moment, the novel forces the revision. That is what free indirect discourse does at its best. It makes you complicit in the blindness you are eventually shown. Austen achieves this through a calibration of narrative distance so precise it is worth sitting with. When Elizabeth observes Darcy and draws her conclusions, the narrative voice does not signal to the reader that Elizabeth is wrong. The observations feel accurate because they are reported from inside Elizabeth's perspective. In Elizabeth's register, with Elizabeth's confidence, but the distance is there. It lives in the slight excess of certainty, in the way her conclusions are always just a fraction too complete, a fraction too satisfying, a fraction too neatly arranged to be entirely trusted, too close, and the reader is entirely inside the character with no external purchase, too far, and the irony becomes a lecture. The character becomes a target rather than a person, and the novel stops being an experience and becomes a demonstration. Austen almost never miscalibrates. In her mature work, this balance is managed with a consistency that, once you understand what she is doing, reads less like craft and more like a kind of second nature. Emma is the most technically demanding deployment of this method in her work, and it represents one of the more ambitious experiments in the English novel of her era. Emma Woodhouse is handsome, clever, Enrich. The famous opening sentence sounds like a compliment. Read carefully. It is a list of the exact qualities that are about to cause serious problems. Handsome means she has received flattery her entire life and has no mechanism for discounting it. Clever means she is capable of constructing very convincing explanations for things that are not true. Rich means she has never been required by circumstance to revise her understanding of the world against her will. The novel places us inside Emma's consciousness for almost its entire length. We see what she sees. We follow her reasoning. We share her pleasures and her irritations and her considerable confidence in her own social intelligence. We watch her arrange Harriet Smith's life with the serene certainty of someone who does not doubt that her own understanding of other people's needs is more reliable than those people's understanding of their own needs. And we are wrong along with her. About Harriet, about Frank Churchill, about Jane Fairfax, about Mr. Elton, about almost everything that matters. Until the novel's structure forces the revision that Emma herself cannot make voluntarily. The moment of recognition in Emma is one of the most precisely rendered passages in Austen's fiction. It does not arrive as a dramatic revelation. It arrives as a quiet shift, almost physical in the way it is described. The uncomfortable recognition of a person who has been telling herself a story and has just encountered evidence she cannot absorb without changing. A sudden transparency, where what had been invisible becomes visible and stays visible, and cannot be made invisible again. She had been witnessing her own blindness without knowing she was watching it. That is what Emma is about. That is what all of Austen's best novels are about. The gap between perception and reality. The way that desire and social training and simple human vanity shape what we think we see. The extraordinary difficulty of knowing your own mind in a world that is constantly offering you more comfortable versions of it. This is not a theme of the 1810s. It is not a theme that belongs to the Regency drawing room, or the English countryside, or the particular social world of women who could not work and could not own property and could not vote and had very few options for exercising any form of agency beyond the management of their own households. It is a theme of every decade in which human beings have lived together and needed to understand each other and have, with remarkable consistency, overestimated their ability to do so, which is to say, it is a theme of now. Mrs. Bennet is funny. She is also a portrait of what happens when a person of genuine anxiety and limited self-awareness uses the social forms available to them as a substitute for genuine engagement with the people they love. Mr. Collins is comic. He is also a portrait of what self-satisfaction does, systematically and irreversibly, to a person's capacity for any genuine human connection at all. Wickham is charming. He is a portrait of what charm looks like when it has been entirely separated from character. When the performance has become so fluent that the performer has forgotten there was ever a distinction between the performance and the person. These are not caricatures of Regency England. They are observations about types that every social world in every era produces, and that every reader who has lived in the world long enough will have encountered in one form or another. Her method required the reader to work. The novels do not explain themselves. They do not signal their meanings with the authorial intrusions common in the fiction of her time. The moments when the narrator steps forward and tells the reader what to think about what has just happened. Austen's narrator is present but not explanatory. The irony is available to readers paying close attention and invisible to readers reading only for the comfort of plot. This is why the novels yield differently at different ages. A reader of 16 finds a love story with obstacles. A reader of 35 finds an anatomy of self-deception so precise it occasionally produces a recognition that is not entirely comfortable. The novel has not changed. What has changed is the reader's capacity to see what was always in it. That is what enduring fiction does. It holds more than any single reading can contain. It releases its meanings as the reader grows into them. It waits, with considerable patience, for you to be ready for what it has been trying to tell you. She was building all of this at a small table in Hampshire, sliding her pages out of sight when the door squeaked. She was building it without a literary community that understood what she was attempting, without critical frameworks that could have described what she was constructing, without any certainty that the people reading her books were finding what she had put in them. She put it in anyway, because the truth of what she was doing did not require recognition to be real. It was there. It has always been there. And 2 centuries later, it is still doing exactly what she built it to do. Chapter 9. The Brothers and the Wars They Fought. Think of a letter travelling from somewhere in the Mediterranean to a cottage in Hampshire. It has been on a ship for weeks. It has crossed weather and distance and the ordinary hazards of wartime correspondence. It arrives at Chawton in the hands of someone who has walked from the village post. She takes it. She recognises the handwriting. She breaks the seal. The letter is from Frank, or from Charles. It describes a port she has never visited, a weather system over water she has never crossed, an engagement or a near miss, or the long grinding tedium of blockade duty off a coast she knows only from maps. She reads it with the same close attention she brings to everything, and the world it describes enters her imagination not as exotic material from a distant elsewhere, but as the continuing daily reality of the people she loves most in the world. There is a version of Jane Austen's life that places her entirely within the contained social world of the novels. The drawing rooms and country dances and morning visits and carefully managed conversations. It is a version the novels themselves can seem to encourage if you read them without asking what was pressing against their walls from outside. But Jane Austen did not live in a drawing room. She lived in England between 1775 and 1817, which means she lived through the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Terror, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, and more than 2 decades of nearly continuous European war that consumed an entire generation of young men and reshaped the map of the world she inhabited. These were not background events. They were the weather of her daily life, and they got into everything she wrote, including the novels, in ways that readers who are not looking for them consistently miss. The most direct entry point for that weather was her brothers. Frank and Charles Austen both entered the Royal Navy as boys. Frank at 12 and Charles at 13. Sent to the Royal Naval Academy at Portsmouth in the years before the wars reached their full intensity. They served throughout the Napoleonic period, rising through the ranks by the combination of competence and courage, and the particular luck of surviving the things that killed many of the men around them. She wrote to them constantly. The letters went out from Steventon, and then from Bath, and then from Chawton, following the routes of naval deployment to wherever the ships happened to be. The letters came back describing the Mediterranean and the Baltic and the coasts of North America, describing the logistics of naval life in wartime with the practical specificity of men who were living it, and writing to a sister they knew would find every detail worth knowing. She found every detail worth knowing. When Captain Wentworth in Persuasion speaks about his years at sea, about prize money and promotion and the life of a man who has made his way in the world through demonstrated competence rather than through inherited position, he is not speaking from Austen's imagination alone. He is speaking from the accumulated knowledge of years of correspondence with brothers who had done exactly that, the texture of his professional life. The way the sea has shaped him into someone the drawing room cannot fully contain, comes from somewhere real. The naval officers in Austen's fiction are notably different from the militia officers. Wickham and his companions in Pride and Prejudice are charming and available and essentially decorative, men whose military connection is a social credential, worn lightly and set aside without apparent difficulty when circumstances change. They have not been anywhere that tested them. They have not done anything that the drawing room has not done, only in a more regimented costume. The naval officers are different in kind. Wentworth, Harville, William Price in Mansfield Park. These men have been somewhere. The sea has made demands on them that the drawing room cannot replicate, and the people who have met those demands carry something that the people who have only met drawing room demands do not possess and cannot easily imitate. Austen knew the difference from the inside. She knew it because she loved the men who had been tested by the sea, and she understood from years of their letters what the testing had made of them. Henry Austen was a different kind of presence in her professional and personal life, and a different kind of complication. Henry was the fourth brother, the one most like Jane in temperament, the one who moved most easily through the social worlds the family's connections gave him access to, witty and sociable and intellectually lively. He had been a militia officer, had left the army, had become a banker in London, and the informal literary agent who managed her relationship with publishers and collected her payments and smoothed the practical frictions of the book, trade for a sister working from Hampshire. In March of 1816, his bank failed. The collapse drew in other people who had trusted him with their money, including Edward, who lost a significant sum. It left Henry with nothing. Requiring a complete professional restart in his mid-40s, he eventually entered the church, the profession their father had occupied before him. The failure affected Jane directly. She lost money she had deposited with him, a modest amount but real, more than the money. She lost the infrastructure. Henry was the brother she had relied on most for the practical management of her literary life, the one whose energy and sociability had made many things possible that would have been difficult without him. Watching him fail, watching the structure he had built collapse under him, was the grief of a sister who understood exactly what had been lost and what the rebuilding would cost. She was also, by the time of Henry's failure, already ill in ways she was not yet willing to fully name. But the presence of the wars in her work goes deeper than the biographical connections to her brothers. It operates at the level of the social world she was describing. The England of the 1810s was a society shaped by decades of war in ways it was not always willing to examine directly. The war had created new money and destroyed old money. It had elevated men of demonstrated ability from relatively modest origins, giving them access to the social world that birth had previously controlled more completely. It had concentrated an enormous amount of young male energy in the military, creating a population of officers present in every county town and resort city, charming and socially available, and often as unreliable as Wickham. The marriage market Austen describes was not operating in a social vacuum. It was operating in a society where the normal mechanisms of financial stability had been disrupted by decades of conflict, where the question of what a man was worth, financially and morally, was considerably more complicated than it had been a generation earlier, where the connection between a good appearance and a good character had been partly severed by a world that rewarded the performance of respectability without always requiring its substance. Wickham is the product of that world. He is the man who has learned to perform trustworthiness so fluently that the performance is indistinguishable, to most observers, from the thing itself. He is not a cartoon villain. He is the specific type that a specific social moment produces. The person whose charm is a skill entirely disconnected from character, and Austen had watched that type her entire life. In the militia regiments that passed through Hampshire, in the county assemblies where young officers presented themselves to the daughters of the gentry, the drawing room she wrote about was never sealed from the world outside it. The wars her brothers fought were the ground beneath the floors of every drawing room in every novel. The letters from Frank kept coming. She kept reading them. She kept filing what they contained in the part of her mind that transformed everything it received into the material of fiction. The world was always in the room with her. She made sure it was. Chapter 10. Persuasion and the Shadow of Illness. The summer of 1815 was warm, and the garden at Chawton was full. She was working. She had finished Emma the previous year and seen it through to publication. She was 40 years old. The cottage, the table, the daily rhythm of Chawton had given her 6 years of productive work that no one who had known her in the Bath years could have predicted. And something was changing in her body that she could feel and could not yet name. The fatigue came and went. There were days when she worked long hours with the concentration of someone who has no awareness of time passing, and days when the pen felt heavier than it should. She wrote about her health in letters with the calibrated understatement she applied to everything she found difficult, acknowledging enough to explain absences and missed obligations without alarming the people who loved her more than was useful. In the summer of 1815, she began a new novel. The central character was a woman named Anne Elliot, 27 years old, quiet and consistently overlooked, carrying for 8 years the specific grief of a person who made a wrong choice and has had a long time in which to understand exactly what it cost. 8 years earlier, Anne had loved a young naval officer named Frederick Wentworth. He had loved her. The match was opposed by her family and by her trusted adviser, Lady Russell, on the grounds that Wentworth had no fortune and no established position, that a young woman of Anne's social standing could not responsibly attach herself to a man whose future was uncertain. Anne, 19 years old, and uncertain of her own judgment against the combined weight of family expectation and trusted counsel, broke the engagement. She has regretted it for 8 years. This is the situation Austen was working with in Persuasion, and it is a situation she had never quite worked with before. Her previous heroines were at the beginning of their stories, making their mistakes in real time, with the future still open. Elizabeth Bennet has not yet met Darcy when her novel begins. Emma Woodhouse is 21 years old, with the whole social world of Highbury arranged to her satisfaction. They have time. They have the future as a space in which mistakes can be revised. Anne Elliot is in the aftermath. The novel begins in the long, quieter grief of a woman who made the wrong choice and has had 8 years to understand precisely what it cost her. Living in a family that takes her competence for granted, and her feelings not at all. Invisible in the way that a useful and undemanding person becomes invisible in a household that has learned to rely on her without needing to think about her. Wentworth returns. He has made his fortune in the Navy. The fortune that would have made the original match acceptable to the people who opposed it now exists, and it arrives carrying within it everything the opposition cost. The plot turns on whether Anne and Wentworth can find their way back to each other across the distance that 8 years of separation and accumulated misunderstanding have put between them. But the question the novel is really asking goes deeper than the plot. The question is whether Anne can trust herself, whether she can believe. After years of having her judgment overruled, and discovering that the overruling cost her the most important thing in her life, that her own perception of what is real and what is right deserves to be followed, whether she can find the voice that the social world around her has consistently trained her to suppress. The Austen who wrote this was not the writer who had produced Pride and Prejudice a decade earlier. The wit is present. The social observation is precise. But the emotional register has changed. There is a directness in Persuasion, a willingness to describe feeling without the full protective layer of irony that the earlier novels maintain more consistently. It reads like the work of a writer who has decided, for reasons that the circumstances of its composition make legible, that there is no longer sufficient time for all the hedging. The scene at the concert in Bath, where Anne and Wentworth are in the same room and unable to speak directly, navigating the social forms that prevent them from saying what both of them know needs to be said, is one of the most emotionally precise passages she ever wrote. Two people who want to speak to each other, separated by the width of a drawing room and the conventions of a society that provides no mechanism for saying directly what needs to be said. Everything happening beneath the surface of what is happening. Every word carrying the weight of what cannot be said alongside the weight of what is being said. She had been living in that territory her entire adult life. And then there is the letter, the original ending of Persuasion, which survives as a manuscript at the British Library, resolves the central situation through a conversation mediated by Admiral Croft. It does what an ending needs to do. It is also notably less powerful than what replaced it. The published ending contains the letter that Wentworth writes to Anne while sitting across a room from her. He is listening to her speak with Captain Harville about constancy, about whether women feel more deeply and hold longer than men do, whether the pain of waiting is different from the pain of leaving. He listens to her speak, and he writes to her what he cannot say aloud across a drawing room full of people. He writes it while she does not know he is writing it. He crosses the room and puts it into her hand. The letter contains 8 words that have been read and returned to for 200 years. You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope. Not the elaborate declaration of a man performing romantic feeling for an audience. The plain specific statement of a person who has been in the presence of something that has gone deeper than manners and social performance, and the careful management of expression that the world around them requires. Austen replaced a technically adequate ending with that letter. She replaced it while ill, in a cottage in Hampshire, in the autumn of 1815 and into 1816, at a table beside a door with a squeaking hinge. She replaced it because it was truer, because the truth of what she believed about genuine feeling and the social forms that both protect and constrain it was more important, at that point in her life, than the protection of ironic distance. Genuine feeling finds its way through the forms. It writes letters across rooms when it cannot speak directly, it waits 8 years if it must. It does not require perfect circumstances. It requires only the willingness to say what is true. She was 41 years old. She was ill in ways she was beginning to understand were not temporary. She was writing in a cottage in Hampshire with the autumn coming in through the window. And she was producing the novel that would, for more readers than any other she wrote, feel most like being found, most like someone reaching across 2 centuries and saying, "I understand what it is to have waited too long, and to wonder whether the waiting has made what you waited for impossible. The answer she gives is no. It has not made it impossible. It has only made it harder. And harder is not the same as impossible." She finished Persuasion in the summer of 1816. The pen would stop in March of 1817, but the writing of Persuasion was the most honest thing she had ever done, and she knew it. She had to have known it. Chapter 11. Winchester, the Last Months. Come to Winchester in the late spring of 1817. It is a cathedral city in Hampshire, 20 miles from Chawton, old in the particular way that English cathedral cities carry their age, not as burden, but as accumulated presence. The cathedral has been standing in some form since the 7th century. Its nave is the longest of any Gothic cathedral in Europe. It watches the city around it with the patience of something that expects to be watching for a long time yet. Jane Austen arrived on May the 24th. 1817. She came with Cassandra. She came because Winchester had a physician named Giles King Lyford, who was considered among the better medical men in the county, and she had finally reached the point where the evidence of her illness could not be managed by the ordinary arrangements of the Chawton household. The precise nature of that illness has been debated by medical historians across 2 centuries. The symptoms she described, the fatigue and the changes in her skin and the periods of weakness, alternating with periods of relative improvement, are consistent with several possible diagnoses, with Addison's disease among the most frequently proposed. Though some researchers have suggested other possibilities, the medicine of her time lacked the tools to identify what was happening, and the distance of 2 centuries makes certainty impossible. What is not in question is what the illness was doing. It was ending her. The house they took was in College Street, a quiet road along the edge of Winchester College grounds, in rooms made available by a friend of a friend. The arrangement was modest and comfortable enough for what it actually was, which was the management of a dying that neither Jane nor Cassandra was yet willing to name directly. The letters she wrote from Winchester are extraordinary documents, not because they are full of grief or self-pity or the explicit confrontation with mortality that a later sensibility might expect from a person in her situation. They are extraordinary because they are still funny, still precise, still carrying the quality of attention that had characterized everything she wrote for 40 years. The notation of what was actually happening, rather than what convention suggested should be happening. She wrote to her nephew, James Edward, in late May, apologizing for not having written sooner and describing her situation with a lightness that is not denial, but something more difficult and more admirable than denial. She mentioned the journey from Chawton. She made a joke. She asked about things he was doing with the genuine interest of a person who has not yet retreated from the world into the narrowing circle of illness. She was writing from a chair. She was too weak most days to sit at a table. Cassandra was with her constantly. The 2 sisters in the Winchester months existed in a closeness that had been the defining relationship of both their lives for 40 years. Cassandra managed everything: the household, the communications with the family, the 100 practical demands that illness generates for the people who are not ill. She created the conditions that allowed Jane to use what energy remained for the letters and for whatever writing she could still manage, which became less and less as the spring moved towards summer. There were better days in among the harder ones. Her niece Caroline, who visited in the Winchester weeks, wrote afterward about what it was like to be in the room with her aunt during one of those better periods. A woman diminished in body and entirely present in mind, whose conversation had the same quality it had always had, the same humour and precision and complete absence of self-pity. Caroline was a child, paying close attention to an adult she loved, and what she preserved is the record of someone who was still herself, entirely herself, right up to the point where being herself was no longer possible. In late July she wrote a poem. The occasion was the Winchester races, an annual event in the city that summer. The poem is light and playful and takes aim at St. Swithin, the patron saint of the cathedral, for allowing the races to proceed in fair weather. It is the kind of thing a person writes when they are feeling well enough to be amused by the world around them and are not yet willing to stop participating in it. She was perhaps 3 weeks from the end when she wrote it. On July the 18th, 1817, in the early hours of the morning, Jane Austen died. Cassandra was with her. She had been with her through the night. In the final hours, Jane lost consciousness. Cassandra asked if she wanted anything. Austen said she wanted nothing but death. She died at 4:30 in the morning. She was 41 years old. Cassandra wrote to their niece Fanny Knight in the days that followed, a letter that has been read for 2 centuries as a document of grief so specific and so honest that it transcends the biographical particulars. She wrote that she had lost a treasure, such a sister, such a friend as never can have been surpassed. She wrote that she was the sun of my life, the gilder of every pleasure, the soother of every sorrow. She wrote that she had not a thought concealed from her. Jane Austen was buried in Winchester Cathedral 4 days later. The stone placed over her grave in the north aisle described her as the daughter of the late Reverend George Austen, formerly rector of Steventon. It noted her Christian virtues and the grief of her family. It did not mention that she had written any novels. The people walking through Winchester Cathedral in the summer of 1817, pausing before the new stone, reading the inscription about Christian virtues and familial grief, had no particular reason to know that the woman beneath it had produced work that would still be read when every other claim made in that inscription had faded into the general silence of history. They could not have known. But the novels were already in the world, already doing what they were built to do, already waiting for the readers who had not yet found them. She had always been good at waiting. She had always known how to be patient with the world. Chapter 12. How she was almost lost. Death hands a person's story to other people, and what those other people choose to tell, what they preserve, and what they quietly remove, what they emphasize and what they set aside, shapes the version that survives into history in ways that can be almost as consequential as the life itself. In the decades following Jane Austen's death, the people who controlled her story had reasons, some conscious and some not, to shape the version that the world received into something more manageable than the woman who had actually existed. The process began within months, and it nearly worked. Think about what was actually at stake. When Cassandra burned those letters, she was making a decision about which version of her sister the world was allowed to see. Not from malice, from love, and from the particular protective instinct of a person who understood that the world was not always kind to women who did not fit the available categories. She burned the letters she judged too private, too sharp, too much. What she kept was what she believed could be safely given. What she burned we will never know. But the burning was only the beginning. Henry Austen moved next. In December of 1817, 5 months after Jane died, he arranged the publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion in a joint volume, and wrote a short biographical notice to place at its front. It was the first public account of Jane Austen as a person. It revealed her name. It told the world that the novels by a lady had been written by the daughter of a Hampshire clergyman who had died that summer at 41. The notice was written with genuine love. Henry loved his sister. His grief was real, and the portrait he drew contained true things. But the selection of true things and the omission of others produced a portrait that was already, in its first iteration, somewhat smaller than the woman it described. Henry's Jane Austen was modest about her own abilities. She submitted to publication only at the urging of people who recognized her talent. She was, above all, good in the specifically domestic sense the early 19th century meant when it applied that word to women. Quiet and kind and unassuming and not remotely difficult, all of this had some basis in reality. She was private about her writing. She was genuinely kind, but the notice left out the sharpness, the capacity for devastating observation that runs through the letters like a current, precise and sometimes merciless in its notation of human foolishness. It left out the real frustration. Visible in the letters, if you read them without the softening filter, at the social arrangements that made women like her dependent on the goodwill of others. It left out the strong opinions about politics and the Prince Regent, and the social changes happening around her, that surface in the letters in ways the novels manage more carefully, but do not suppress entirely. It left out the parts of her that were difficult, the parts that did not fit the portrait of the modest, good, unassuming clergyman's daughter who happened to write charming novels. Then the silence. For half a century after Henry's notice, the official version of Jane Austen was largely the one Henry had constructed. People read the novels. The novels grew more famous. But the woman who had written them remained, in the public imagination, the gentle, retired figure that Henry had described. The question of who she actually was, what she actually thought, what choices she had actually made and at what cost, was not being asked in any public or sustained way. The larger work of softening came in 1869. James Edward Austen Leigh was the son of her brother James. He had known his aunt as a child, had genuine, warm memories of her, and in 1869, 52 years after her death, he published a memoir of Jane Austen. It was the first full biographical account of her life, and it established a version of her that would shape popular understanding for the better part of a century. The version Austen Leigh presented was, in several important respects, a construction built from selective use of genuine material. His aunt was a woman of the most gentle, quiet, and unobtrusive disposition. She was cheerful and contented with little. She sat in the corner of a room and occasionally wrote things down. And the things she wrote down were charming and funny and entirely incapable of disturbing anyone or making anyone uncomfortable. He had access to letters. He had family memories. He had the testimony of people who had known her, and he chose from that material in ways that consistently favoured the gentle and the domestic over the sharp and the political, that consistently presented her writing as the natural overflow of a sweet temperament rather than the disciplined work of a serious artist doing something technically difficult and consciously ambitious. He also framed The Squeaking Door in terms that influenced every subsequent telling as evidence of modesty and feminine propriety, a reluctance to be known as a writer, a wish to keep the literary and the domestic worlds entirely separate. The practical reading is different. A writer hiding her pages is not ashamed of them. She is protecting her work in a shared space where private space does not structurally exist. Those are not the same thing, and collapsing them into each other, making the practical into the psychological, the management of shared space into evidence of self-effacement, was one of the smaller but more consequential distortions of the memoir. The memoir served purposes that went beyond biography. By 1869, Jane Austen had become famous in ways that required explanation. Serious critics were comparing her to Shakespeare. Others were finding in the novels a social analysis of genuine depth and edge. The question of how a clergyman's daughter from rural Hampshire had produced work of that quality was one. The culture of the period was not entirely comfortable answering honestly. The honest answer required acknowledging that she was a serious, disciplined, intellectually ambitious artist who had made deliberate choices about her work and her life, who had strong opinions, who had refused a proposal of marriage, partly because she understood that a certain kind of domestic life was incompatible with the kind of writing she intended to do, who had spent 40 years producing work of a technical sophistication that only became apparent when you looked at it closely enough. That answer was available. It was in the archive. It was in the letters that Cassandra had not burned, in the juvenilia that Austen Leigh himself had limited access to, in the manuscript evidence of a writer who revised deliberately and with full understanding of what she was doing. The memoir chose a different version, the comfortable version, the one that made her achievement feel less threatening to the social arrangements that her novels, read carefully, were quietly and systematically examining. The recovery of the real Austen has been the work of literary scholarship across the 20th and 21st centuries. R. W. Chapman's scholarly edition of the letters, which made the full correspondence more widely available for serious examination in 1952, was an early turning point. The letters, read in their entirety, are not the letters of Austen Leigh's gentle domestic saint. They are the letters of a person with strong opinions and a precise and sometimes devastating way of expressing them, interested in politics and money and the social world around her with an intensity the memoir had chosen not to foreground. Feminist literary criticism from the 1960s onward found in the novels a sustained and sometimes sharp analysis of what women's social constraints cost the people who lived within them. Not the cheerful acceptance of limited circumstances the Victorian version promoted, but something more searching and more honest than that. Scholars, including Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar, Margaret Ann Doody, and Claudia Johnson produced readings that restored the sharpness that the softening process had tried to remove, revealing a writer who was more politically aware, more formally ambitious, and more consciously critical of the social world she depicted than the memoir had allowed the public to see. The Jane Austen, recognised by serious scholarship today, is a considerably more interesting person than the one Austen Leigh presented in 1869. She is a writer who understood exactly what she was doing and did it with deliberate skill. She is a person who made difficult choices with real costs in the service of work she believed was worth making. She is a thinker whose questions about self-knowledge and social performance and the relationship between intelligence and wisdom are not the quaint preoccupations of a Regency drawing room. They are permanent questions. The people who tried to make her smaller were not villains. They were people of their time doing what people of their time did with women of uncommon achievement, fitting them into the available categories because the categories were more manageable than the alternative. But the alternative was always there. In the novels, in the letters, Cassandra did not burn. In the juvenilia and the manuscript revisions and the letter to Clark declining to write about the House of Coburg, the small sketch that Cassandra drew of her, now in the National Portrait Gallery in London, shows a woman with a direct gaze and a composed expression that does not resolve into the sweetness the Victorian iconography preferred. The eyes are watchful. The mouth carries the particular set of a person who finds the world interesting and is not going to pretend otherwise. That is the face the memoir tried to soften. It did not succeed. It never could have, because the novels were already in the world, and the novels, read honestly, have always told the truth about who wrote them. Chapter 13. Why She is Still Here. 207 years after her death. Jane Austen's novels remain continuously in print and continuously read, not as historical artifacts that scholars consult, not as assigned texts that students endure, as books that people choose, that people return to, that people press into the hands of other people with the particular urgency of someone who has found something they need the other person to have. That is not the residual authority of an academic syllabus. That is the novels themselves, still doing what they were built to do at a small table in Hampshire more than 2 centuries ago. The literary reputation came first and came from people in the best position to judge. Sir Walter Scott, the most commercially successful novelist of the generation after Austen. Read her with genuine admiration and genuine humility, which is a rare combination in a writer encountering a potential rival. He wrote in his journal that he could do what he called the big bow-wow strain himself, the grand historical drama, the sweeping narrative, but that the exquisite touch that renders ordinary things and ordinary characters genuinely interesting was a gift denied to him. He knew what it was. He knew he did not have it. Thomas Babington Macaulay, among the most authoritative literary voices of Victorian culture, placed her beside Shakespeare as a creator of characters who feel independently real, who seem to exist beyond the pages containing them, who behave consistently and surprisingly in ways that only genuine characterization produces. Virginia Woolf, writing in the early 20th century as both a great novelist and one of the most perceptive literary critics of her era, identified in Austen the quality that would come to define what serious fiction became in the century after her: the movement inward, the understanding that the most significant action in a novel happens inside the consciousness of the characters rather than in the external events the plot assembles around them. Austen had been doing this since the 1790s. The century that followed her was still working to fully understand and extend what she had built. The adaptations tell their own story. Each generation has made its own version of the novels, and the fact that each generation has felt compelled to do so is itself evidence of something. Stage versions appeared in the 19th century. Film adaptations began in the silent era. The television and film productions of the 1990s reached audiences that might not have found their way to the novels through formal education. And the persistence of those productions in popular culture suggests they connected with something real, something that was in the source material, and that the adaptations, at their best, found a way to make visible. Each subsequent generation has made its own version. Clueless, the 1995 American film that transposed Emma to a Beverly Hills high school, understood Austen's method well enough to replicate it in an entirely different cultural setting. The heroine, who is confidently wrong about everything around her, whose social intelligence is genuine, but whose self-knowledge is limited, who must be forced by events into the recognition that her understanding of the world is more partial than she has assumed. That is Emma Woodhouse. It is also Chair Horowitz. The structure is the same because the structure is true, and truth does not expire with the social setting that first produced it. You have probably encountered some version of this in your own life. A person who was certain they were reading a situation correctly, whose confidence in their own reading was exactly the thing preventing them from reading it accurately. Austen built a literary method on that observation. She made it the engine of 6 novels, and 2 centuries later it is still the engine. In every adaptation, in every reimagining, because the observation is still true. The academic debates about what the novels are actually doing have been genuine and ongoing and productive. Is she a writer who finds in the social arrangements of her time the necessary structures of a stable society? Is she a writer exposing those arrangements as sources of injustice and self-deception? The most thoughtful answer, and the one that seems most consistent with what the novels actually do, is that she understood those arrangements as both necessary and insufficient, as providing the structures within which human beings organize their lives and simultaneously constraining and distorting the lives they were supposed to organize. That is a complicated position. It is also a true one, and it is the position that makes her worth reading in every century that comes after her. Because the problem she was examining is the problem every century has to examine in its own terms. The problem of living within social structures you did not choose and cannot entirely refuse, of trying to see clearly in a world that provides every incentive to see what is comfortable rather than what is true. She did not solve that problem. No writer solves the problems they examine when the problems are real. But she described it with a precision and a humanity and a refusal to oversimplify that makes the description still useful more than 2 centuries after it was written. The question she kept asking is still open. Can you see yourself clearly enough? Not perfectly, not with the detachment of someone who stands entirely outside their own experience, but clearly enough, with enough honesty about the limits of your own perception, enough willingness to revise your first impressions, enough humility about the stories you tell yourself, to make the choices that your actual situation requires, rather than the choices that your flattering self-image suggests. Elizabeth Bennet gets there. Emma gets there. Anne Elliot has already gotten there, at significant cost. And what Persuasion asks is whether getting there too late is the same as not getting there at all. The answer the novel gives is no. It is not the same. It is harder and it costs more, and the way back is less certain. But it is not the same. That is a generous answer, and an honest one. And it has reached across 2 centuries to people who needed to hear it in ways that Jane Austen could not have predicted, and would probably, in her characteristically unsentimental way, have found slightly overwhelming. Think of that cottage now. The morning light coming in at the angle that was good for reading. The sound of the household beginning its day in the rooms around her. The road outside carrying its daily traffic. The pages on the small table covered in the handwriting that would eventually reach every corner of the world. The door with the hinge that squeaked, ready to give its warning at any moment. That is where it came from. Those ordinary mornings in an ordinary cottage on a road in Hampshire, in the hours that the rest of the world did not know were extraordinary. She is still here because she built something at that table that told the truth about how human beings see and fail to see. And the truth she told does not belong to the 1810s, or to England, or to the social world of the Regency drawing room. It belongs to anyone who has ever been confidently wrong about something that mattered, which is to say, it belongs to everyone. The table is gone. The cottage still stands. The road still runs through the village. And in every house where the novels are open tonight, in every language they have travelled into, in every mind, finding for the first time, or the 10th time, the particular quality of being understood by someone who wrote 2 centuries before you were born, the light from that table is still reaching. It has not stopped. It will not stop. Settle in. Let the world outside go quiet. She has been waiting to tell you something. She always has. Good night.